everybody, we can get going here, so we don't have too much of time. If you're a SOCRA member, don't forget that you're going to do your certification. So if you are SOCRA certified, please make sure you sign in so that we can, if you're audited, then we at least have a record. If you're interested in becoming a SOCRA member, you can certainly talk to me after the presentation, and I can give you some suggestions on how to do that. Today we've got a really great subject to talk today about. It's the Health Canada inspection from a clinical trial sites perspective. And Anna Glybina is going to talk to us today about that. She's currently working at Seven Oaks General Hospital, where she works in the Chronic Disease Innovation Center. If any of you have not gone down to see what that center looks like, it's quite an amazing thing. Do they still have the little swinging chair there? Yeah, it's quite cool. Anna comes from our northern neighbor. She's from Russia. She completed a medical degree there in Russia and has done fellowships in nephrology and also in internal medicine. She moved here to Winnipeg in 2016 and took a position over as a clinical trials coordinator with the CDIC and has been working there ever since, basically coordinating clinical drug trials. With that, I will turn the microphone over to Anna, and she will give you a presentation on her site's perspective of a clinical trial inspection.
Thank you. Such an honor to be here and an honor to represent CDIC, and it's so true. If anyone hasn't been there to our site, you're welcome to visit, and it will be great. So let's start. My presentation is about Health Canada inspection, which we had been through this summer. So objectives of this presentations are to describe the steps in preparing for inspection, to outline the inspection process within our perspective as a site, and to learn how to respond to observations and to improve your practice. Basically, what to do before, during, and after the inspection. I have to say that I'm not affiliated with Health Canada, and I'm not certified to train anyone on inspection on what to do. We're just sharing our experience because we think that this might be helpful to other sites and coordinators. And I also need to mention that personally, I wasn't a coordinator of this specific trial that we had the inspection for. I helped with the inspection process because the coordinator wasn't working with us anymore. So there was basically that the main person wasn't there. So I had to jump in and work for that. Just as a note, Health Canada started performing such inspections in 2000. In the year 2000, and their main objective is to reduce the risk to subjects enrolled in clinical trials and to ensure that research activities are performed according to regulations on clinical trials involving humans, which include GCP, Good Clinical Practice, and as they've been described by International Conference on Harmonization. Approximately 2% of all clinical trials get inspected each year. So you can imagine how lucky we were to get it. So inspection starts with a notice of inspection. You receive that, and usually your PI receives that, and that's how it looks. You get it by email from the inspector that we're gonna do the inspection itself. So the notice has useful links and your pre-inspection package attached to it. The package has frequently asked questions, the checklist for preparation, and the document checklist. Those are general checklists, pretty much include everything that you have on site, all the documents that may be inspected. But it's still very helpful to go to those links and to review their processes. You need to make sure that everyone is notified. Sometimes Even though the emails come to the PI, they might not be available or they haven't seen it or something else. So you need to make sure the study PI is notified, the site manager if you have one, or the project lead. Obviously the contract research organization, if you have one for this trial, and the sponsor. Also, depending on your site setup, you need to notify the local lab and the pharmacy if you're using them. Some sites have their own lab and pharmacy, and that might be easier. But if you're using an external lab and pharmacy, you need to notify them of the inspection, and you need to make sure that everyone is available for that time. You will need them and their documents, and you need their help, and you need them to participate as well. That's why I say that you need to coordinate separate meetings. So if you are using external facilities or people, you need to set up meetings with them, obviously, or conference call if that is not possible. You also need to work closely with the CRO and the sponsor to prepare for inspection. They will know about inspection for sure. They will get notified. They're actually CC'd on that email that the PI gets. And when they know about it, they will contact you as well, and they will usually try to set up some help for you. So ideally, you want the CRO and their sponsor representatives to be present on site during the inspection. Sometimes it may not be possible, but they might want to organize some kind of remote help. So it might be via conference calls or video conference calls, or they might send some representatives to your site. Before the inspection, if you have time, the CRO usually gives you a training, a short one, that will help you to prepare for inspection. They might be more knowledgeable or experienced with inspections. Also, they might know something about this particular trial that is useful for the inspection as well. Our site had help from CRO. They sent 2 representatives that were on site at all times. And they also, the sponsor was available remotely. They were available via phone calls and conference calls as well. So the CRO was our main mean of communication with the sponsor. So if the inspector requested anything about the sponsor or about the trial in general, the CRO was there to help with that. So the first thing is to get yourself ready. First of all, don't panic. I know it sounds really scary. Believe me, I've been through that. And in the end, it's not going to kill you. And it's going to be actually very useful. It's a learning experience, and you get a lot from that. You come up with that conclusion way later, but that's what it is. The inspection is not focused on your personal mistakes or on the site's performance in general. It's also focused on the sponsor work, the CRO work, and even the RAB. So everyone should be involved, and everyone should take care of that, not just you personally. Don't think that if your site has been picked, that is something wrong with your site. Don't think that. So usually there might be issues with a particular trial or with a particular investigation product. So that might be something that will trigger the inspection. Other criteria for site selection, as stated on Health Canada website, the recruitment rate, so it's either too high or too low, which was our situation. We had a low recruitment rate, and I'll talk about it later. The overall number of clinical trials conducted at the site, and also the number of serious adverse drug reaction. So that might be something that investigational product is to blame. You need to make yourself available. You as a coordinator will be the main person assisting with inspection. That And that means you will need time, and that means you will need to set aside something else that you have, other projects, and you need to find coverage for that. You need to prepare for long days and potential overtime, potentially on the weekends. That happens too. Just know that this is what your life is going to be for the next week. It might be useful to talk to someone who has been involved in the inspection before, which is what you're doing basically. And also, if you have someone who hasn't worked on this trial, but who's knowledgeable in general in clinical trials, you might want to meet with them, and you might want to ask them to look at the documents of the study to look for potential issues. Please be mindful of the confidentiality, because you can't show anything that has patient information. You need to book a separate room for inspector to work in, and if that is not possible, at least prepare a separate desk. They need a lot of space, they need quietness, and they need to work well. Don't think that inspection is over when the inspector leaves your site. It's not. The inspection is usually like about a week, but only after all the responses has been sent and that response is accepted by Health Canada. That's when it's over. Getting everything organized. So you need to prepare a review and be familiar with all study files on paper or electronic, IP storage and documents, source documents, patient's medical chart, your site's regulatory documents, study staff qualifications and training certificates, and any external facilities documents as well. You have to know where everything is. You have to make checklists where the documents are and table of contents. So the main task of you as a helper during inspection is to quickly find and provide the document that inspector is requesting. In this thing, you need to review everything beforehand, and you want to look for potential issues. If you worked on this trial, and if it's this trial, your trial, you might want to look at the documents as if you're a stranger. So imagine that you're looking at them for the first time in your life, and you want them to be perfect, pretty much, which is not possible, but you can do that. Also, you have to be knowledgeable of the fact that some inspections are done for the trials that are already over, so all your study documents may be archived. So if that's the case, you will need time and maybe money to retrieve those documents from the archives. And also, if the study is using an electronic database, that database may have restricted access, obviously, or some documents might be password protected, and you might not even be the person who did that, so you might not even know, but you might need access to that anyway. If the study is over and the database is locked, your access is not valid anymore, even if you worked on this trial. So you might need to contact the CRO to set up a read-only access for the inspector, because they will want to look at the electronic database as well. So here's the inspection process in numbers. We received the notice of inspection on June 1st. That was a Friday, 10 days before the inspection. The inspection timeline was notified in the notice, and it was Monday to Friday next week, in 10 days, sorry. So the inspection worked actually 4 days. That was because our site didn't have too many participants and there were not too many documents to work on. We had one inspector on site. They inspected one clinical trial, and there were 3 people mostly involved. The PI, the site manager, and study coordinator. We had 2 representatives of the CRO on site on all the days they were there. We received the final exit notice in a month, and then the response to that is expected in 30 days, and the final completion letter received in another month. So altogether, it was about 3 months. We had the clinical trial was a drug trial, and it was double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled, multi-center. And the study was actually carried in 2016, 2017. So at the time that we had that inspection, the site has been closed for 1 year and 1 month. So that didn't stop them from coming to see us. We had 3 patients enrolled. 2 of them were screen failed and 1 randomized. So we think that that was the main reason for us getting inspected, that we only had pretty much one patient. And that patient has been transferred to another site in Winnipeg. So that might be another reason. And after that patient has been transferred, the site was closed. And we were thinking we were done. We were not. So when the inspection starts, you're looking at a week of work. On the first day, there will be an introductory meeting. The inspector would show up at the site, present with identification, and that would be a business card. And the PI ideally has to be there to meet the inspector, and he or she has to present her identification as well, the business card. Our PI was available. He works on site. He didn't stay in his office like 9 to 5, obviously, but he was around, and he was always talking to inspector, asking whether he needed him or not, and if she did, they could book a meeting or just talk, and then he would do his own stuff. The designated person, who's usually a study coordinator, has to be there at all times, all the time. You will need to make notes, and you will need to assist with any requests. At that introductory meeting, obviously the CROs are present, and the sponsor can be present remotely or not as well. The inspector would discuss the scope and the agenda of the inspection, and plan any other meetings that would need to be set up. After that, every day it will be mostly documentation review, interviews with the staff, facility tour, and exit meeting every day, concluding meeting at the very last day, and then any other conference calls after that. The interviews with the PI and study staff, they were not very specific. Sometimes they included a certain discussion on a certain observation that inspector has made, and we would need to come up with explanation or reasons or any documentation that you can attach. They say that inspectors might be tricky, and they might ask the same questions from different people, or they might use some investigation techniques, and we didn't have that. We didn't experience that. The inspector was very nice. We actually really liked her, and we didn't have that issue. As for documentation review, all records created during the conduct of clinical trials are subject to inspection. So you can't hide anything. Everything might be inspected. It doesn't mean that everything will be inspected, but you have to be prepared. I only mentioned several. I didn't mention all of the documents that might be reviewed. This is a list of what was reviewed at our site. You have to make sure you have original files and you provide them for inspection. those original files have to have proper signatures, proper dates, and everything. The correspondence is very important. You have to save everything, all the correspondence for clinical trials. Save it all. If you don't print it, at least save it on your shared folder, on your drive. Have it all ready. It might help you to answer some of inspector's questions. We had that event of the transferring the patient to another site, and that was one of the big questions during inspection. So we had to provide all the documents, all communication on that topic to the inspector. He needed to make sure that that transfer was conducted properly and that the patient was safe. Facility inspection comes next. Pretty much, inspector will look at everything. They might not be very specific, but these are the things that will be inspected. So study file storage, access to them, labeling, and archiving facilities if you have those. All the equipment that has been used in the trials, calibration for them, maintenance, and any other records that you have. So that equipment might be like blood pressure machines, weigh scales, lab equipment, any devices that the patients have been given. That is very important. For example, our patients in our trial had glucometers given to them for their blood sugar control, and the inspector needed to make sure that those glucometers had all the approval documents and that that device was safe for using by a patient. If you're using external pharmacy or lab, there will be questions regarding the IP. They might be referred to you and to pharmacists as well. So you have to be knowledgeable of all the documents, and you have to be knowledgeable of all the regulations. For example, emergency code break, if that happens, what would you do? What's the procedure for that? Who has access to the storage area? How does the environmental control set up? Who keeps track of that? How does the labeling work? What is on the label for the patient to see? If the label is translated into other languages, how do you keep the IP after the study is done? Where do you send the remaining IP that you have, or whether you're destructing it at one site? Those are the questions that inspector will ask. If you have the pharmacist, they will help you with that. They should know all those details, but you have to know them as well. For the lab, they will ask for accreditation documents, all the study files, and they might check the equipment like freezers or anything that was used for the trial. So we were using the Seven Oaks Hospital lab, and the shared health helped us with the inspection. The representative came and was on site during the meeting with the inspection for the lab. So she provided the documents, she provided the answers to the question that inspector had. And after the inspection, she even sent the SOPs that they use to inspector by email. All the procedures that your site has will be inspected as well. They might be inspected by looking at your documents, but they also might be inspected by talking to you, just asking questions. What are your SOPs on informed consent feature? And you have to know that. Confidentiality protection is a big issue. We know that, and everyone has to store that information properly, and the access to it should be restricted. Any electronic files should be password protected. Those are the basic rules, and we usually all know about them, but sometimes we forget, or we think that, yeah, I'll do that later. But that needs to be done. Investigators' involvement in all and important events and decisions. That is a big issue. We, as a study coordinators, sometimes help our investigators too much. We work hard and we give them all the documents to sign, or we would give them some events to attend. But you need to make sure they were actually involved. And the inspector needs to make sure they were actually involved. And since the inspector is not present at that moment, the only way they can see that it's been done is if you document it. If you don't, it never happened. You can't prove it if it's not on paper or electronic file. The IP is the most important thing in the drug trial, obviously, and all the procedures that are done with it, receiving, storage, accountability, destruction, or shipment, everything has to be documented and everything has to go under regulations. The information transfer process is very important as well. So what we get is our interview with the patient or the chart, the medical chart, but we then transcribe that to paper CRF and the electronic CRF. So all these three things have to be identical, perfectly identical. That sometimes doesn't happen, but we have to achieve that. The inspector will compare what is in the medical chart, what is in your study chart, and what is on the electronic database. It all should be the same. This is just some advice to how to behave yourself during the inspection. Obviously, you have to be professional. You have to take notes. Those notes will help you in future. It will help to help someone else, or just to record the information that is important, what happened. Pretty much you take notes of everything. There can be too much notes. If inspector is interviewing someone else and you want to take notes on that as well, and you want to be present in the room, obviously ask permission to do that. Usually inspector is fine with that. Do not volunteer non-related information. If inspector is asking you a certain question, try to answer that question without giving a full discussion of everything else. The inspector doesn't need that, and you don't need to give information that might trigger extra questions. You don't need that. When the inspector asks you or someone else a question, you don't have to, it's not a trial, it's not an investigation of a crime. You don't have to answer right away. You have a right to clarify the question. You have a right to ask for time to answer. You have a right to refer to the source document. You don't have to have it all memorized. That's not possible, obviously. And you can discuss with someone else before answering. Make a list of all your site's clinical trials. That's something that we don't usually have, but inspector has been asking for that from us and from other sites as well. I heard that before. You have to keep a list of all your site clinical trials. It doesn't have to be very detailed, but it has to have information: how many patients were screened, how many patients were consented and enrolled, randomized, how many are actively participating, how many are withdrawn, and for what reasons. That is just basic information that helps you track things and also gives inspector the scope of your site's work. And it might trigger extra inspections or not, but you have to have that list. When the inspector asks for documents, those documents should be original ones. The inspector can ask for copies to be made. When you do that, you have to keep a list of all the documents requested for copies. Our CRO representatives asked for another copy for their records. So I was making 2 copies, one for the inspector, one for CRO. And when you do that, don't forget to stamp or mark that it is a copy, date, and sign, or put your site stamp if you have that. Be available, be there, accompany the inspector. They don't know their way around your site. It's probably the first time they ever been there, so someone has to be there to help at all times. You don't have to sit right next to them. You don't have to look at their computer. That is actually not allowed. But you gotta be available and you gotta be ready to help or answer any questions. So when it's done, the inspection findings, everything that inspector finds, are discussed at daily meetings. She or he will tell you, I looked at this and here's what I found. The list of all the observations are given at the concluding meeting, and then the exit notice draft is compiled. It is discussed with all the participants of the inspections, with the site, with the sponsor, and the CRO. The inspector usually makes a conference call, and they would list all the observations and everything that's been found. Here's a cover letter for the exit notice. So this is the cover letter only, and it will have more pages with the observations itself. Each observation is given a risk rating, and the overall rating is assigned to the site. You can, during the daily meetings, you can resolve the majority of the findings by answering the questions, by providing the documentation, by finding some extra communication documents on that, and those issues can be resolved. When the inspector discussed the final notice with you, everyone should come to an agreement regarding that. So if everyone is in agreement, the sponsor, the site, the inspector, that's when the final notice is ready. The overall rating, which is what you want, they may provide it orally at the very end. They might say, I think your site will be provided that rating. They might not. It depends on the inspector. But the final decision will be only stated in the final exit notice. So here's a classification of observation, and it is taken from the Health Canada guide that they use. So there could be 3 different kinds of observations: critical, which is risk 1, major, risk 2, and minor, risk 3. So critical observation is the worst, honestly. It means that there was a situation that was fatal, life-threatening, or unsafe for enrolled subjects. That is not good. So in general, that might be, there are some examples here, that might be that the trial or the drug was not even authorized before this clinical trial, some falsification of the data, or fraud, which is a no-no, that you don't keep records of major events at all, or that the sponsor is withholding the data from Health Canada in order, like as a fraud. So all these critical risk observations will be, if they're made, the sponsor and everyone else, and RB as well, will be immediately notified, and these observations will likely result in the attribution of a non-compliant rating, which is bad. Sometimes the sponsor is given time to work on those, but you just don't want that to be in your inspection at all. So most of the observations are usually major or minor. So minor observations might be something like incomplete log or minor errors in data transcriptions, or documents are not dated, or source data is stored in not very secure location. Other than that, everything is a major observation. In case of major observations, the compliant rating is usually assigned. So it means that you had mistakes, but you're still fine. Still, the non-compliant rating might be assigned if the major observations indicate lack of control overall, or some repetitions of the observation after prior inspections. So if your site had a previous inspections and there were some observations that you were supposed to correct and you never did, and now it's a new inspection and you're still doing the same mistakes, that would be a thing that might give you a non-compliant rating. Depending on the circumstances and their number, the minor and major observations can be escalated to major and critical accordingly. So if you have a lot of major ones, you might still get to critical. If you want an example, we had five in total observations, 3 of them major and 2 minor. The example might be as, for example, we had an ECG assessment done for the patient, and the ECG was analyzed by the cardiologist on site, but that cardiologist wasn't on the task delegation log. And our principal investigator signed that ECG as well, but the date that he signed it was after the date that coordinator put the information on the electronic database. So that would mean, if you look at it from my point of view, I know how that works, but to inspector, it looks as if the study coordinator received the assessment and put the data into database without telling the investigator. So that means the investigator wasn't involved. So that is a major observation. Some minor observation was something about drug shipment conditions and the temperature control for that. So sponsor obviously was responsible for that, and they provided an explanation. So overall site rating can be compliant or non-compliant, and you wanted to receive a C. C rating doesn't mean that there are no observations or that no measures are required. It will be still more work for you. Non-compliant rating, however, can result in different actions. Sometimes the sponsor will have time to work on it and maybe improve the situation, but sometimes it can lead to suspension or cancellation of the clinical trials. So after you receive the inspection exit notice, you have to respond to that. And you have a month to do that. You work together with the CRO, with the sponsor, depending on how the observations were classified. They can provide some information, you can provide some information. It will be a combined effort. We discussed it via conference calls, by email. Any documentation can be sent back and forth. Response had a short cover letter and then a detailed explanation of every observation and corrective measures plan. As for a corrective measures plan, there was an action owner who is responsible for doing it, who is going to do what, action description, and the due date by which it should be done. Any supporting documentation can be attached to the certain observation or the response in general. Health Canada, After the sponsor submits the response, Health Canada will assess that response according with the Division 5. And if they deem it satisfactory, that's when the inspection is considered closed, and that's when no further response is required. So here's what final letter looks like. It will tell you the most wanted things that the inspection is done. And that will be 3 months later, pretty much. So the corrective measures plan is what you will need to work on after that. It will be in collaboration with the CRO and with the sponsor. They will actually require and control what has been done on site. It might be retraining for the staff on some regulations that were mentioned in the observations. It might be that the update on the SOPs and working procedures is needed. Or for active studies, some corrections on the electronic database should be done. The sponsor may require that, but for that you need to have your access still active. And they're usually a month to do that all. When your training is done, you submit the final document to the sponsor, and that document has your report of what has been done. So after everything is done, you still have to work more. This is some advice that we think was useful. So you need to make a binder for all site staff that will have all their qualifications, training, any medical licenses, anything that might be useful, and anything that is required, CVs, that is required for clinical trials. So having that central binder helps you keep track of what is there and when it needs to be updated. You also have to make electronic copies of all the documents you have in the binder just in case something is lost or just to be safe. However, when you have a clinical trial that requires all those documents to be in the trial binder as well, you put original documents there and you keep the copies to yourself. Very important, you all know that to have good documentation practices. Sign and date everything. Make sure copies of source documents are certified by you if you did that. Put a date, sign, say that you copied it. If principal investigator signs anything, the comment or the date or anything that they sign under should be written in their own hand. Sometimes coordinators do that they put everything for the investigator and he or she just needs to put a signature. That is not very good. He or she needs to actually do it themselves. If you have documents that you sign, I understand that it might not always be possible, but it's always better if you have double signature. So you sign as a coordinator and the PI signs. That means he's aware, he's participating, he knows what's going on. Also, there should be a working procedure for your SOPs that describes the process and timeline for a PI to sign required documents. Just like ECG assessment or lab results that you get from the central lab, the PI needs to sign them. But when? How long is long enough, or how long is too long? That needs to be described in the working procedure, and those working procedures should be specific to this site, and they should actually describe what you're doing. They also should comply with the regulation, obviously, but they have to be real, and you have to be knowledgeable of them. Always be mindful of basic rules and regulations. We all work, we have too much work, we get distracted, we forget, but when it comes to important things, and clinical trials are important things, you have to be professional and you have to keep track of everything. Also, learn from your mistakes. Anything that you ever done or anything that someone else done, you can make a good conclusion out of that and you can actually use it for next time. This is what we all should know. ALCOA principles plus CCEA. I wouldn't go into too much details. Just be mindful. Tarpan had a presentation on that a while ago. It hasn't changed. This is what we have to be knowledgeable in our everyday work. This is the basic stuff, but we usually sometimes forget about that. And the CCEA is the complete, consistent, enduring, and available when needed. So that is the extra components that ALCOA has been added with. Any questions or comments are welcome, and I thank you all for this presentation.
Questions from anybody?
Thank you.
I just have a question.
That theme wasn't announced for sure. The inspection was just a general inspections. And even if she had a theme, we didn't notice because in 4 days, primarily like everything can be inspected and everything will be. So it didn't matter for our site what the theme was, if it was there. Everything was inspected. So the pharmacy, the IP, the lab. It wasn't too comprehensive for the lab and pharmacy, but it was for sure comprehensive on the documents. All the documents that we had for that trial, 2 boxes, all of it was reviewed.
So in terms of that, like,
The only questions about that was where their office is located for shared health, and if that representative who was on site, if she was the only one who works on it and who's in charge. And the specific question was regarding the freezers we used in the trial, how the temperature control works, who keeps track, who's recording the information, and also the SOPs that they use as a shared health, because those are separate from our SOPs. So she asked for the representative to send that to the inspector. You're welcome. Yes, so that binder that I was talking about was reviewed. So medical licenses, CVs for the doctors, and the training that the coordinator had. So first of all, GCP. And there was a little trick with that because we were doing GCP training with the city group online. And when we did that, our certificates didn't have an expiry date. It said NA. So everyone thought that that's good. But some trials, the inspector didn't say that, but some trials actually have the setup expiry date for that. So the trial needs your certificate to be valid within last 2 years, for example. And you need to be knowledgeable of that, and you need to keep track if your certificate is actually fresh. Yes, yes, they did. And they even compared the dates when the training was held and when, for example, for pharmacy, they have to have training before they even touch the IP. So that date when the IP was shipped to the site has to be after all the training completed. You need to keep track of that.
Conversation.
Yes.
And I know that you, was it, I think I advised you. Was it helpful?
It was very helpful.
I knew you were in a unique situation.
Yeah.
I really felt for you. I have to say I felt for you.
Thank you.
Was it helpful, and you I can have it myself, have a name I can provide to people like yourself who your site never had an inspection. Did you find talking to someone about that person?
Yeah, we did, and I actually mentioned that if you can arrange that when you've been notified of the inspection coming, if you can arrange to see someone to meet with people who's been through that, it's very helpful. They might, well, we never knew what that is actually. We heard about the inspection that it can happen, yeah, but we never actually get involved in it, and you never actually know until you get it what it's like. So discussing it with someone who's been through that, it was very helpful. And we had a person who was experienced with inspections, but they were really like way a lot of time ago. So her experience was not as fresh, but it was still very helpful to know what to do, how to behave, how much scared should I be, or actually you shouldn't be.
Yeah, I know. I have one more question because I just know because you were the coordinator, but by the monitor, because one of the observations I'm kind of surprised that in a trial that has monitors that would not have been picked up prior to, whereas an investigator initiated trial is very different. So I just had your site being monitored by the monitor?
Yes. This trial had a CRO, and we had monitors working with us, and it actually was the first clinical trial our site had ever. So the whole setup was a lot of work, and it was a lot of learning effort for us, and the monitor helped, but I wasn't there. But I think that the monitor we had was not too experienced as well. So it was a learning curve for both our site and the monitor. And I guess we all had our mistakes. That's why I say that inspection is not about the site only. It's about the sponsor and it's about the CRO. And it's maybe even more about them because they're the controlling organization that have to keep track on all that have to give you advice as a site what to do or what not to do, and they have to be knowledgeable of all the issues. The sponsor themselves did not show up for inspection in person at all. We only had the CRO representatives they showed up at the same day as the inspector, a couple hours prior, but we had a 1 2-hour presentation by the sponsor and the CRO on that Friday before the inspection. And we worked through the weekend.
like to add to what the way it was the important. There is a difference between folks in this industry. Everything is usually done by it happens when the trial is ongoing. The inspection, as you mentioned, study had already got over. It was 1 year past, 1.5 years past the site goes out. And usually inspections happen when the entire study data is available for the inspector to look at. And the main difference between an audit and an inspection is that inspection has a legal connotation. It happens by a regulatory body which has some legal control over the system. And they can blacklist you as the investigator, or they can send notices to the sponsor, and they have a larger scope of review. If they come to inspect study X, they also have the legal permissions to extend their review to study Y and Z at the same site. So nobody can stop them. Whereas an audit is restricted for that study. Basically, that's the difference.
Yeah, and that's why the inspector asked, what are the clinical trials you have at your site? How many of them are still active? How many patients you have? And if something in that information that you provide triggers extra questions or follow-up investigation, that can happen.
It would be helpful for the REB if you guys do have inspections for us to get the report, particularly when we were doing more audits. Some of the extra documentation that is a result of that. The big thing is educational. That's what we have is new changing the study personnel. Increasingly, we're noticing that's the point. Is there appropriate training? So we're asking all those questions. We're trying to help you without being there, right? So that's one of the things. So that's why it would be helpful. I was interested in the comment about you having a list of studies at your site. That I was interested in. I haven't.
We didn't have it before. We didn't have it before.
Yeah, but now
and
yeah.
Actually, that was the advice from the person who's been through inspections.
Okay.
She told us about it, and after she told us, the inspector actually asked the question, and the inspector asked me to provide the list. But when I said we only had one other clinical trial, she said, "Okay, that's fine. You don't have to make a list because it's just one." But if we had more, that would be, yeah. So that was the advice of the other person.
Just in the same deal idea about, with phase 3. Our RED got inspected. They were looking for on our database investigator initiative. So when some people say, well, why do you make me go to all this? Why do you make me go all this work to Health Canada? I said, they come in, they look at it, and that's what they were specific. That would have been very hard for them, but they, I guess they could have failed. There's no sponsor. So just that's the same thing with the list. It's almost as if you would have to have a list all the time. But I hadn't heard about the list.
Well, it gives them the idea about the site in general.
Yeah.
I guess that's helpful. I think what we came upon with regarding the training is that there are no requirements for GCPs, which should be set up, our opinion, by RB or like someone higher or the university. They have to say that your GCP training is valid for 2 years or 3 years, and that's when you have it certain, and that's how you know when you need to refresh that. Because we were, hey, expiry NA, so we're fine, but we were not. And for the new trial, they told us we need to have the certificates within 2 years. So that's how we got in all that story.
I think that's a company.
Yes, but when I asked them about it, they were saying if you have any other reason to have the certificate valid for longer, please provide with documentation. And we never had any rules or regulations regarding that. You might want to set up this in your SOPs. If no one else does, you can set that in your site SOPs that your certificates, your training are valid for certain years. That might be helpful.
Just a quick comment. So I was at another talk a couple of years ago where it was from a site perspective as well. And just so that you guys are aware, typically the inspector will show up. And what happened with this site was the coordinator came out, saw the inspector sitting there and said, "Oh, you must be Donna," and took her to the back, and they proceeded to get on with the inspection. The site was cited for that because they did not show the ID. She did not request any ID. So make sure that when you approach the inspector that you ask for the ID or some sort of identification to indicate that it was the inspector, or you'll get a cited on it. The other thing I'll just let you guys know as well is, I'm not sure how many of you know, but the site findings are now, you can find some of the site findings on Health Canada website. You can Google it. It doesn't give you a lot of detail, but it gives you kind of a flavor as to what they're looking for these days as well. So it's pretty easy. Just put down Health Canada clinical trial audit findings, and you should be able to find where that is. Great.
Here's my contact information. If any of you need help with or have more questions, I'm always eager to help you with that. And call, email, we're here.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.